Hello and welcome to another lesson of American history. Today we're going to be tackling a pretty broad topic, cultural interactions between Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans. So let's dive in by looking at our learning objective according to the AP U.S. History Framework. Explain how and why European and Native American perspectives of others developed and changed in the period. So we want to really look at those cultural interactions. And so we've got to go back to our concept outline. And what we see here is that there were mutual misunderstandings between Europeans and Native Americans, which often defined the early years of interaction and trade as each group sought to make sense of the other. Over time, Europeans and Native Americans adopted some useful aspects of each other. So we're going to be addressing some of those mutual misunderstandings. As European encroachments on Native American lands and demands for their labor increased, Native peoples sought to defend and maintain their political sovereignty, economic prosperity, religious beliefs, and concepts of gender relations through diplomatic negotiations and military resistance. So here we're going to be addressing the Pueblo Revolt, probably the most well-known rebellion by Native Americans against the Spanish. Extended contact with Native Americans and Africans fostered a debate among European religious and political leaders about how non-Europeans should be treated, as well as evolving religious, cultural, and racial justifications for the subjugation of Africans and Native Americans. So here, we're specifically going to be addressing Bartolome de las Casas and his defense of the Native Americans. So we're going to first address cultural differences, religious subjugation and rebellion, debates over treatment, and the Asiento system. So to review here, what do we already know about the initial encounters between indigenous peoples and Europeans? Well, what we know is that when Columbus first arrived in the New World, there was an excitement about trade opportunities on both sides. However, the cultural misunderstandings began very quickly after that. And so how we're going to be going through this is that we are going to be addressing some customs. We won't go through each of these specifically, but here are some of the differences that would have led to those misunderstandings, conflict, and subjugation of indigenous peoples. So if you want to take out a notebook and copy this chart down, this is kind of a good general framework for you to understand some specifics in the differences. Now, we're going to be addressing American Indians as one group and Europeans as one group. But as we know, these are going to be massive generalizations, which are helpful to understand, but we must remember that this won't be true for every person within a group. So really this idea of simplifying culture down to all American Indians, all Europeans is a difficult one to tackle. So let's start by looking at land ownership. For the most part, American Indians viewed the land as the land use as temporary and communal use. And so a plot of land might be used temporarily by a family or a group, but then in the next season, it could be used by someone else. And so when Europeans came, they might allow Europeans to use the land, but they didn't consider that to be permanent ownership. Europeans, however, viewed the land as something they owned, individually owned. They put up fences. And so they were confused and frustrated when American Indians continued to use the land after they had purchased it. In regards to property and trade, for American Indians, this was an incredibly ritualistic ceremonial activity where it was seen as an incredibly positive thing to be generous, to give gifts, and to be a source of wealth for others. And so in American Indian communities, we see a fairly egalitarian or more equal type of society. And with Europeans, it was a business transaction. It wasn't something they wanted to complete this huge ceremony for. They just wanted to get in, do the business deal, and move on. And the more you accumulated, the higher your status. And so American Indians believed Europeans to be greedy and selfish by allowing others to starve. They were frustrated when when Europeans would come without gifts. whereas Europeans were frustrated by the amount of rituals demanded, and they looked down upon American Indians as not really understanding how business worked. Family and gender roles. Again, this one is going to be incredibly varied within these groups, but for the most part, men would have done hunting and fishing, making war, and thus could be away for several months. So women were in charge of the farming and had much more greater influence and freedom. And in some cases, especially for example, our more East Coast Native American groups, many were matrilineal. So a husband would be adopted into the wife's family versus the other way around. In Europe, men led the household, did the outdoor labor, made war, and women had much fewer rights. And so American Indians believed that Europeans really didn't have any skills when they came to the New World. They didn't know how to survive. And Europeans believed that the American Indians were uncivilized because of their flipped gender roles. And then in regards to religion, American Indians really had a non-exclusive way of looking at the world, a variety of spirits in the natural world, a great creator, and they were happy to include the Christian God into their pantheon, but they weren't going to, for the most part, be exclusive to that Christian God. Europeans have, specifically if we're talking Spanish here, were very Catholic and were very exclusive. We see lots of religious war that happens in Europeans over this exclusivity. And so when they converted Native Americans, they were frustrated when they would continue to participate in various rituals to their other gods. So here's a basic framework for you on some cultural differences that really led to those major misunderstandings that occurred as more and more interactions between American Indians and Europeans occurred. Now, it's important to note, though, that the feelings of superiority were not just on the European side. American Indians also believed that they were superior in some ways. So here's a quote. As for the Indians, evidence suggests that they often viewed Europeans with disdain. The Hurons, a Chagrin missionary reported, thought the French possessed little intelligence in comparison to themselves. Europeans, Indians said, were physically weak, sexually untrustworthy, atrociously ugly, and just plain dirty. Spaniards, who seldom if ever bathed, were amazed by the Aztec desire for personal cleanliness. A Jesuit reported that the savages were disgusted by handkerchiefs. They say, "We place what is unclean in a fine white piece of linen and put it in our pockets as if something very precious, while they throw it upon the ground." The Micmacs scoffed at the notion of French superiority. If Christian civilization was so wonderful, why were its inhabitants leaving? So a lot of times teachers really just focus on how the Europeans had these feelings of superiority toward the Native Americans, but it was reciprocal. So moving on to our next topic, we're going to be talking about religious subjugation. And here's where we're going to get into another term that you might be familiar with, the Treaty of Tordesillas. So what happens is we have the Pope, who is in charge of the Catholic Church and really at this time has a lot of political power. And so when the New World was discovered, he divides it up. He draws this imaginary line, the line of demarcation, and he says any land to the, on one side of this line is going to be for Portugal, and the other side of the line will be for Spain. Now, as you can see here on this map, it is not a equal division of land. While Portugal got the east, which was essentially just Brazil, present-day Brazil, the Spanish would have had access to the rest of the continents. And so in 1494, we see the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is going to move the line of demarcation further to the west. So what does this tell us about the worldview of Europeans? Well, it's all about those feelings of superiority, right? It's that the New World was something to be conquered. It was something to be owned. It was something that was easily conquerable. The fact that someone thousands of miles away could just declare this land as owned by a separate European country really is a great example of that superiority that is often addressed in the APUSH curriculum. Now, if we want to really, really simplify things and look at Pocahontas, which obviously has varying degrees of accuracy here, you can look at the interpretations of land by looking at two songs from Disney's Pocahontas. So, Mine, Mine, Mine is the song where they're talking about how they want to mine the New World and everything they have is mine. And then you have The Colors of the Wind, probably the more popular song in Pocahontas, where Pocahontas is talking about how the Europeans don't understand the life that is in the land and that it is not something to be owned. Again, simple comparison here, but might help you to do that comparison. Additionally, with the religious subjugation, we see the Spanish bringing missions. And so we're going to see various missionary groups coming over to Mexico, to the Spanish Southwest. And we're going to see thousands of priests converting our American Indians. Now, they were converted by force. It was quoted that the American Indians must be ruled, governed, and guided to Christianity by fear more than by love. And those who did not follow the Spanish practices, the Catholic practices, were whipped, they were punished, they were killed, they were forced into labor. And so really we see religious conversion, cultural assimilation, and forced labor really going hand in hand. Here's another quote. Though they seem to be a simple people, they are up to all sorts of mischief and are obstinately attached to the rituals and ceremonies of their forefathers. So this is going back to our idea of those religious differences, is that many of our American Indians were not exclusive. And so even if they accepted the Christian God into their pantheon, they still were continuing to do the rituals and ceremonies that were their tradition. So this is going to lead to the Pueblo Revolt, also known as Pope's Rebellion, in 1680. And this is an important one to remember because it's the most successful of the Native American rebellions at the time. It was well planned. Over 400 Spanish were killed and 1,500 colonists were forced to flee. Many priests were killed. And it led to the destruction of many items associated with the Christian religion. And for the next decade or so, a little more than a decade, the native peoples in this area, the Pueblo especially, were able to reassert their control. They did this outside of Spanish influence. And so this is an important moment in history where the flood of European influence was stopped temporarily. So the Spanish interpretation of this is that it was a rejection of Christianity, that the people were working from the devil. They had hatred for the Spanish. And really, the historians who have written about this have tended to rely on the limited sources completely from the Spanish perspective. But some new historians have come and provided alternative views. And one of the biggest things that they talk about is that in the decade before the Pueblo Revolt was a time of severe difficulties for the Pueblo people. There was drought, famine, disease, Apache raids, and they're supposed to be praying to this Christian God, but he is not protecting them. And so they blamed the Spanish gods for their destruction, and so they turned to their own religion to lift those droughts, to help the starvation, and then would have been punished for those activities. And so this Pueblo Revolt was a quest for liberation from the Spanish religion. Additionally, kind of a spark was the hanging of 4 indigenous peoples that were accused of witchcraft. So this would have been something that would have happened more consistently as people returned back to their more traditional beliefs. So not all Spanish missionaries believed in forced conversions. And someone who protested these conversions, these types of conversions, and the overall treatment of the Native Americans is Bartolome de las Casas. And Las Casas is so important. I have a whole video on him. You can check that out for additional information. But in reality, he once was an encomendero. He had his own encomienda where he had Native Americans laboring for him. Then he became a priest and couldn't find a way to bring together his religious beliefs and the way that Native Americans are being treated. And so he gave up his land, returned to Spain, and began to advocate for for better treatment for American Indians. And he originally suggested to use Africans instead of American Indians due to some racist ideas, but by the end of his life, he deeply regretted that idea. So here's a long quote, and I know this video is getting long, but it's going to talk about, we'll just kind of summarize it here. It's talking about that men were sent away for a long time, months at a time, and women were labored in the field, and both were so exhausted and depressed that when they saw each other once in a very long while, they basically stopped procreating. And the mothers, because they were so overworked, often did not have enough milk to feed their babies. And so Las Casas talks about how he's seeing thousands of children die, and that the population of American Indians is not just being depleted by the effects of disease from the Columbian Exchange, but they're actually thousands and thousands are dying as a result of the encomienda system. And so here's just one example of what's called the Black Legend, where Las Casas is describing the Spanish cruelty. His words do lead to the new laws of 1542, which legally ended American Indian slavery, and it began to end the encomienda system. But there were so many rebellions by the Spanish encomenderos against this that the king eventually repealed parts, and it really wasn't strictly enforced. So the last topic we're going to talk about here is the Asiento system. As American Indians were killed by disease, by labor, by conquest, the Spanish began to bring more and more people from Africa, specifically West Africa. And there was a tax that was required to be paid for each enslaved person they imported. But this was originally endorsed by Las Casas because he believed that Africans had no souls. And so really we're going to see the justifications for slavery be moved to a racial justification. The Asiento system was seen as essential due to the desire for gold, wealth, the encomenderos trying to increase their wealth, and the Spanish crown trying to become more powerful. They did emphasize the importance of conversion, and they did force assimilation and complete subjugation. So, as we've talked about, Europeans and Native Americans developed these differing views, these perspectives on each other and also on Africans as the conquest, as the colonization of the New World increased. So I hope this video was helpful. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you for our next one.